Okay, I'm Tom Wyant of Killbuck Valley Mushroom. My wife is Wendy Wyant. A few of you have probably heard of us over the years. We've been operating Killbuck Valley Mushrooms now for about 20 years. So we're considered a fairly experienced mushroom grower. Right now we're in the Shiitake and lion's mane production facility. What you see on either side here are Shiitake blocks at various stages of maturity. In order to produce Shiitake blocks, we actually use locally sourced green sawdust. Green sawdust is the sawdust produced when they rough cut logs straight out of the forest. If you've ever cut wood straight out of the forest, you know it has a very aromatic smell to it. Each species has a little bit different aroma to it, but those aromas generally are antifungal compounds that the wood produces. The reason the tree produces that is to keep fungi, like the ones that we're growing here, from attacking a live tree. These mushrooms are not parasitic. They wait until the tree is fully dead, and then they colonize the dead wood. So when we cut that wood, we have to air it out for a while. The antifungal compounds, fortunately, evaporate easily, which you can tell by the smell of the wood. That's those compounds going away. After a couple of months of aging, we will mix that sawdust with some rye grain and the right amount of water, about 60% by weight of water. After we've mixed it, we put about 6 pounds, just use an ordinary grain scoop, into each of these bags. These bags are a little bit special. They're a special kind of plastic called autoclavable polypropylene. Autoclavable means that they can withstand high temperature without warping or being damaged. The reason we need to do that is after we put the sawdust into the bags, we pressure cook them for about 4 hours. We pressure cook them because sawdust laying around outside will grow nothing but mold unless you sterilize it very well. And since these are relatively slow colonizing species of mushrooms, we have to do a pretty thorough sterilization. So when we first cook them, they look much like this, which is just like wet sawdust. It's been cooked thoroughly. And after it's cooked thoroughly, we'll put it in front of a laminar flow hood, which laminar flow hood is basically a set of filters that produces perfectly sterile air. When it's in front of that area, we make sure it's fully cooled down, of course. We can open up the top without fear of contamination because we have a wash of perfectly sterile air coming over top of it, just like an operating table in a hospital. We open the top and we put a little starter culture from our laboratory into the sawdust. We then basically just pinch the top together, shake it vigorously to mix the starter culture throughout the sawdust. We press it. I have just an ordinary lever press to compress the sawdust very tightly together. A side note, Shiitake mushroom means oak mushroom, so they like to grow in extremely dense wood, so we want to compact that sawdust substrate very tightly together. And then after it's compacted nicely, we pull a bit of a bubble on top here, so there's a trapped atmosphere. And then we use an impulse sealer to melt a strip across the top of this plastic, sealing it from the outside environment. Now, you would say, how does the colony then get the air to metabolize the sawdust? Well, each one of these bags is built with a little microporous filter patch. That microporous filter patch is made such that nothing can pass through it bigger than 0.3 microns. So gases can pass easily back and forth through it, but anything as large as a fungal or bacterial spore would not be able to pass through it. So each one of these bags will be its own sterile environment, but we can get air exchange to allow the colony to grow still. The maturing stages, as it grows, that's newly inoculated, basically looks just like wet sawdust. Then here we have what's called whiteout, which is when the mycelia colony has spread enough that it's throughout the full substrate bulk, and then they get bumpy. I don't see any right here that are bumpy, but that's called popcorning. And then the final stage, you can see the bumpiness in the final stage still, but the final stage is what's called browning, which is when the culture, which is running in the sawdust, wherever it is exposed to good light exposure, it will form a brown, like artificial bark surface around the outside. What the colony is doing at that point is orienting itself to the outside world so that it knows where it can grow mushrooms and spread spores to surrounding logs and such. So it's preparing to fruit at that point. To get all the way to this stage is about 2.5 months. The next part we'll see will be when we actually fruit them. Alright, what you're seeing here is the fruiting room for the Shiitake facility. You will, once the colony is mature and you're browned all over the surface, they're ready to produce mushrooms, but you need to give them the right trigger to produce mushrooms. So what we do, what works well for us with this particular strain of Shiitake is we will stack them on carts and put them in front of the fresh air intake for the room. And perhaps you can hear the fans going constantly. We, at night and in the morning when it's nice and cool and damp out, we draw air continuously into these rooms because it's perfect for mushrooms. During the heat of the day, we'll shut them off for a while and just kind of try to hold it around 65 degrees is our ideal temperature. Now, when we first trigger them by putting them by that fresh air intake, it's a sudden drop in temperature. It's called a temperature shock. Big mystery there. They will form these baby mushrooms. At this stage we call them button mushrooms. Button mushrooms does not refer to just the mushrooms you get at the store. They call them that because they're just immature mushrooms. They haven't started releasing spores yet. But these buttons will swell like a ball until they burst out of the surface of the colony, all around the outer surface. And then from there it only takes about maybe 3 or 4 days to get to this size where you have the whole block covered with mushrooms, nearing harvest. What we look for the harvest is we turn the blocks upside down, and we just pick all the mushrooms that have opened up enough to show the gills underneath. An immature mushroom, what's called a button mushroom, is when the cap is still folded against the stem and the gills aren't showing in the mushroom grower's world. So we want for Shiitake ideally to just be showing the gill surface for about a day, and then we'll pick those. But you can pick them at any stage you like. After we've picked the first, we call that a flush of mushrooms, we allow the blocks to sit typically for maybe 2 weeks at this temperature. And what they do is they slowly recover. They've lost a lot of water weight. They've lost some weight in sawdust as well. And as they recover, they metabolize more of that sawdust and they prepare for a second fruiting. And just before the second fruiting, I need to give them another trigger to say, okay, it's time to give me some more mushrooms. We've had enough time to recover. I'll put them in a soak tank and I'll submerge them in cold water, just groundwater in this area, around 60 degrees. Once again, cold enough to stimulate a fruiting response, and I'll get a second flush of mushrooms. Generally speaking, we've been, we call it 2 flush and out. And the reason we do that, we aren't actually certified organic anymore. We have been for like 18 years. We just dropped that certification, but we still are philosophically organic. And we don't want to use pesticides to control the bugs in here. So we flush them 2 times. At that point, you start to get a few bugs show up here and there that will attack the colony. Just get rid of them. We'll put up new blocks. Sawdust is cheap and, well, labor's labor. So we're able to do that economically. We're happy to do that as a service for our customers. All right, we're over in the oyster production facility now. Oysters are a little different. They colonize more quickly. They're native to this area, so they're very familiar with the conditions that we grow things in here. We don't have to do a full pressure sterilization with oyster mushrooms. Here I can get away with using, instead of sawdust, I use straw, wheat straw in this case. I chop it fine, I pack it into these large baskets that I make, and then we just boil it for half an hour or so. That will pasteurize it like you pasteurize milk. It'll knock back most of the competition sufficiently that the oyster mushrooms will be able to outcompete anything that remains. So we really don't have competition troubles in the oyster facility because they colonize in just 2 weeks instead of 2.5 months. So this is my little setup. You can see I've got a block and tackle to lift the heavy baskets out of the boiling water. It's awkward to handle if you don't have some handling equipment. That's on a track, so I can slide the basket after most of the water's drained out of it over top of this platform. Here I will have a little cart, just an ordinary garden cart, with the top of a barrel only about 4 inches tall as a drip tray, so I don't make a mess in my sterile room here. And we roll it right into our sterile room and shut the door behind us. This now becomes my sterile area. When we're in the sterile room, I will take a basket of straw, which is basically the size of a barrel, and I'll take the top half of it off and put it into this, which is what I call my inoculation chute. The inoculation chute is lined with plastic, so before I use it, I can wipe it all down with bleach water. 10% bleach solution is a pretty effective sterilization technique. Wipe every surface that the straw can possibly touch with the 10% bleach solution, and then I roll it into this room where I can put the strip door up on the ceiling, and I can have a 5-foot long column coming off of this funnel at the end. By the way, the funnel is just a chimney flashing you can get at the local hardware store. So the column is tube. It's 4 mil plastic tubing, which you can get in large rolls. Generally, they produce it for industrial purposes. I get it in 50-pound rolls. It's seamless 4 mil polyethylene plastic. Very common stuff, very easy to use, and recyclable if you know the right people. So we take half a basket, we stuff it through after we've cooled it thoroughly and put a starter culture in it, just like we do with the shiitake mushrooms. We mix it thoroughly, and then we stuff it through the funnel into the tube. It's kind of like making sausage, perhaps if you've made sausage in the kitchen. It's just like monstrous big sausages, 10 inches in diameter and 5 feet long. I know it sounds like a griller's dream. We're going to go in here and see some of them hanging. Now, I did production on Monday. This is actually today a Thursday. So we have some fairly new columns here. And all these is wheat straw. I don't put any actual nutritional supplementation into these because wheat straw comes with quite a bit more nutrition than plain sawdust. There's always a little remnant wheat, and there's bran and chaff and such in there as well. Anyway, after it's boiled, I put the starter culture in it, and each one of these little white dots here is an individual mycelial colony spreading out from an individual rye grain, which the rye grain was our inoculum, our starter culture. We'll get to that in the laboratory in a little bit. But you can see that after just a few days, the colonies are spreading out through the straw, and they're starting to merge together. The goal here is we want to keep at such a temperature and keep the colonization rate such that we have full white out. This column will be all smooth white after about a week. These ones here have been up for about a week and a half, and as you can see, they're well colonized and ready to start putting up some mushrooms for me. So the next stage at this stage will be to stimulate the cell transition into mushroom growth. This is what we call vegetative growth or colonization in this room. So we stimulate a fruiting response, and then we'll produce mushrooms on these. Alright, we're in the fruiting room now. One other thing I failed to point out in the colonization room is the way these get their fresh air. You can see there's no filter patch. So what we do, that colonization room is a sterile facility. It has a sterile air feed, and positive pressure, and all the entrances and exits are sealed. That's why we closed the door when we brought our cooked straw in. They get their air simply through punched holes. I punch holes in the plastic with an ordinary hunting arrowhead. And you can see there's holes punched on a grid pattern about every 4 inches. That gives it sufficient airflow to allow the mycelia to colonize. And like I said, oyster mushroom colonize so quickly and so aggressively that I can get away without the fancy, expensive filter patches. Just holes punched and kept in a sterile facility is sufficient. Now, when we move, what you can't feel on the film is that when we moved from the colonization room to this room, we dropped from about 78 degrees down to about 65. It's a lot cooler and more comfortable in here. It's also a lot moister. I don't run it up to 100% humidity, but I like it to be around 80% humidity in the rooms. That allows enough dryness that the mushrooms, as they're growing, can transpire. And what transpire means is that all of what makes this mushroom comes from the colony in liquid solution. So it's got to circulate out to the surface of the mushroom, do its thing in terms of growing mushroom cells and allowing reproduction, and then evaporate away. So we need to have less than 100% humidity, or else that water piles up on the surface of the mushroom, which can cause deterioration, and wet surfaces tend to promote bacterial decay, so we don't want that. We want to keep these mushrooms surface dry. I have a lot of fans scattered around the room to get the right amount of turbulence in here to get good mixing. I'm always drawing some fresh air through the room because we need to replace the oxygen that the mycelial colony is using in order to do its thing. When these mushrooms go from this baby stage, which is sort of what we call button mushroom in the oyster form for a clustering mushroom, to this mature stage, that takes maybe about 3 days. These are ready to pick this morning. We want to pick them at sort of an ideal stage. Really, we want to pick them when we're shaped like this, as opposed to when they fold up more and become more flat or funnel shaped. because we want to catch them before they get to what they call mass spore release. At the right maturity level, a mushroom does its thing, which is to release reproductive cells. They call them spores for mushrooms. And if you get that and you let a lot of that happen in the room, it will make a sticky surface on the fans. It'll gum up all your equipment. You don't want to do that. So we pick them a little bit young of mature at an ideal culinary stage. Okay.
I'm Wendy Wyatt, and I do the laboratory of the mushroom farm. And it all starts with the mushroom mycelium, which I've got growing on this culture plate here. If you were to compare mushrooms to plants, which they're not plants, they're a fungus, but if you were to compare them to plants, the mycelium would be like the tree, and the mushroom itself would be like the apple. So it's the mushroom mycelium I'm trying to propagate in here. So I start with it in the culture plate, and after it grows over the culture plate, I take a little piece of the mycelium and I put it into a liquid, a broth, and in one of these flasks. And it'll grow throughout the broth. And then I sterilize rye grain, and I pour a little bit of the broth into each bag of rye grain. And you can see in these bags right here, the mycelium's just starting to grow. It's just starting to turn white. And as it progresses, the bag of rye grain will completely turn white because every individual kernel of rye is infested with the mushroom mycelium. So then we use this as our seed to seed into the bulk substrate, either the sawdust or the straw.